Hello everybody, it's Mike Levin. Tuesday, September 27th, around 9:20 a.m. This morning I am walking along 34th Street instead of my usual 29th or 28th Street, which I usually use to avoid the tourists, but I figure so many people who watch this consider the quote tour of New York part of the feature. I figured I'd change up my course a bit and walk along here where the tourists are. I'm passing Macy's right now. Last night was the first of the 2016 presidential debates, and it was as much of a reality TV train wreck as I imagined it might be. Wow, it's hard to imagine two candidates put together on stage for better entertainment value, and it's a little bit scary knowing that one or the other of these people is going to be the next president of the United States. And I would, just imagine that someone who's been in training for this very job for 20 years now or more is better qualified and certainly more presidential. It's hard to even imagine the next 4 or 8 years in the other scenario. Well, anyway, that's enough of politics. People get that plenty of other places on the internet. I thought this morning I would talk about something that flows very easily. When I make these videos, I never script them. I just typically know what I want to talk about, and it comes naturally. So it has occurred to me I am actually on the 3rd iteration of my current system, a generic API mashup into spreadsheet type systems, and this is a sort of rhythm or pattern I've gone through before. 3rd time's the charm. My first system, I made the first version of it almost before there was even web scripting technologies. I guess most things around at that time were Perl, but I cut my teeth on something called IDC, Internet Database Connectors. It was a Microsoft technology that predated VBScript and Active Server Page. It also had HTX files, so together it was IDC HTX for the database connector and the HTML templating system. And then when I moved over to VBScript and Active Server Page, I did the 2nd iteration of the system at Profit 21, and it was way too verbose. It was powered by config files, massive config files that had to define every little detail. And then the 3rd version of the system, I basically made a table interrogator so that you only had to point to the table, and the system would step in and figure out the relationships between that and its related tables, and a web app would spring into existence. And I got tremendous mileage out of that. And where the time's different, that would have been like a Ruby on Rails GitHub type thing, but it was like 1999 and on VBScript. So flash forward many years, and my attention switches from these CRUD applications, basically relational database things that views the whole world as a web cart. That's one way of looking at it. But nonetheless, that's the underlying application premise behind things like Ruby on Rails and many of the frameworks out there, app building frameworks, web app or otherwise. And I got that out of my system because Google Docs with Google Sheets now, it is less necessary with all those collaboration features and the security permission features. It is all you need for like 90% of your web apps that you would have normally had something custom built for in the past. It is custom. You're configuring your spreadsheet. And of course, it's backed by the IT infrastructure of Google. You might have some momentary delays or timeouts in the user interface, either web-based UI or the API, but that's the price of free. It's still a better tech infrastructure than 99% of the tools out there you could choose to use, and you'll have your files with you probably to the, to your deathbed. You're never going to lose them so long as you don't lose your login. So, and so long as things like Google don't go out of existence or stop providing those services or yada yada. But it's all odds, and you're always choosing what to place your bet on. And Google and cloud is no worse than any other bet these days. And so much for crud web apps. So my attention went to generic data investigations, answering questions, querying, hitting multiple data sources, spinning it together into answers. And that path has led me down to doing 3 mashup iterations with Google Spreadsheets. The first one at 360i, that was called Tiger, where you essentially set up everything in your Google Spreadsheet config-wise. All your arguments and parameters had to be defined in the spreadsheet itself. And then the whole API, the whole part of it that I built was a button that says go, and it was a bookmarklet. It was built as a little piece of JavaScript and a bookmarklet that triggered off all this stuff that happened on servers in the background. But the bookmarklet would send the Google Doc document key and stuff like that over to a server, and the permissions had already been worked out in old school pre-OAuth ways, and you could see the spreadsheet twinkle and update in front of your eyes as things went out and did crawling and API hitting, and pulled it back and used the GData API of Google to drop it into the spreadsheet. So that was version 1. That would be the equivalent of my IDCHTX version of my new stuff. But it was even Python in those days. All 3 iterations of my new stuff was on Python, and it's been probably 6 or 7 years since then. So I've had quite some time to get familiar with Python and learn to program more Pythonically, such as it were. Enter iteration 2 of my system, which I started when I was unemployed / freelance after 360i, and continued on while I was at Profit 21, and that was Pipulate. And I was very proud of Pipulate, but it did end up being the extremely verbose version, because I provided the whole environment. I did it was a Flask web app, and so I did a lot of the building of the user interface stuff myself, and had to knit it all together and sort of delve into the state of JavaScript and CSS at the time, keeping it all as lightweight as possible so that it could run on very lightweight servers, because I also felt I had to provide the entire Python code execution environment so that all this stuff would be usable even by noobs and stuff. So I could have gone with that. I could have finished it, polished it up, but along comes Jupyter Notebook, a code execution environment that everyone could equally have. So I no longer had to provide my own code execution environment to people in the form of Linux or other lightweight virtual servers. And it's a much more robust and capable environment, great for noobs because of the interactive environment. They call it REPL, I think, where you can write code, execute it, and investigate the state of it as you go interactively, instead of the other model, which is writing it in a text file, saving it, and then compiling or executing it. So Jupyter Notebook is a wonderful REPL environment. And so the third version of my system, Jupyter Notebook based. However, Jupyter Notebook is soon going to be evolving into Jupyter Lab, which provides all the wonderful widgetized input-output window panes that an application like mine can benefit from. So I'm setting myself up to really move over to Jupyter Labs as soon as it's in beta and out of alpha, which it is now. Even I don't have the stomach to base my day-to-day work, which I'll probably actually be exchanging with people using Jupyter Notebook for what it's for, which is exchanging data and processes so that other people can reproduce it. The background, you might hear me talking about Jupyter Notebook a lot. It used to be called IPython Notebook, but its backstory is that Mathematica is an application that's very popular in universities for analyzing data, for doing mathematics on data, so that you can show processes and keep it recorded in sort of a notebook fashion, saying, here's my data file, here's what I did when I loaded it, and here are the subsequent steps. The problem is that Mathematica is expensive. You have to pay for the license. It's firmly under the category of the software that has become massively popular out there prior to the momentum of the free and open source software movement. So Python came along. Some people who needed to do this sort of stuff, I guess Continuum.io, the folks behind a package called Anaconda and Jupyter Notebook, decided that they were going to do a Mathematica clone, call it what it is. And now you can do all this stuff that previously was in the realm of expensive proprietary software, used often by students, so there were student licenses. But even the student licenses were pretty expensive. And now suddenly you could do it with Python with totally free and open source tools. And not only does that make it applicable for what Mathematica was used for in academia and research and science, it also makes it very, very useful to the marketing world, because processes where you can hand around data files and programming code and know that it's all going to execute in a reliable way and produce the same results and not have execution errors of getting everything set up just right, or even just unknowns. Like it was apparently some sort of scandal not long ago that about 30% of all scientific research studies were unreproducible. Other people could not reproduce the same results given the same data sets and the research papers that were written on the topic. So it became very important to fix that. And yeah, so the scientific community spawned Jupyter Notebook, and marketers around the world are jumping on that bandwagon too, because that's precisely the same thing you need in marketing. You create an algorithm, programming code, it does something clever, it hits multiple data sources, it does various things with it, transforms, correlations, and visualizations, and gives you actionable data. And every time you run it, it could give you new actionable data. And you don't need to be a programming guru or even particularly a technical person to reproduce it, because Jupyter Notebook, you can just load up something, hit run, and get the result. It's a lot like running an Excel macro, but better, because you won't have antivirus warnings. So that is what I am currently doing with version 3 of my system. I'm making a generic API mashup investigation, visualization system where these things can be bundled up and just sent around to your coworkers to teach them how to produce the same deliverables you're capable of producing. So sharing the wealth, such as it were. And also teaching them a little bit of Python, because they're going to have to go in there and change some configuration values, unless you code everything to take input parameters that you have to plug into fields in a very web form-like way, which is possible. There's no reason to not do that, except that, you know, editing the Python code is just sitting right there on the screen. You can intermingle it with Markdown, so you can put headlines and documentation, you know, in context right around the programming code. You can say, you know, edit the following values to have the name of, say, your website, your Google Analytics profile ID, and that's it. Now when you hit run, it'll use your website, your profile ID, and if it's wired to use like the last week's worth of data, it'll be connecting and getting a fresh data source as well. So all these little nuances are taken care of so that whenever you run it, you get fresh data, new actionable items, and voila, the world is a wonderful place. Your deliverables are scalable, reproducible, and quite simple, easy to read, and a way to for each of the people participating to pick it apart and start using these techniques and methods for themselves, i.e. learn to program, except hopefully sounding less scary because you're just sharing scripts that you can run with just minimal changing of configuration values as sort of your doorway into doing more ambitious modifications to the code. Anyway, that's version 3 of my system. It's currently called SEO Notebook in GitHub, although I am gradually changing its identity back into Pipulate, and I'll probably be erasing the old Pipulate Flask version of this from the GitHub repo, because I'm basically abandoning it and don't want it out there causing any sort of, say, support liability or confusion, and all my efforts will be flipped into this new thing, SEO Notebook. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again soon, and don't forget to subscribe.